This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com.
Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about routinization. Now, this is a topic that's come about because I've had several listener suggestions for topics concerning language acquisition, and I think routinization is an interesting way to sort of segue into language acquisition and to start talking about that in a more principled way. So, first off, I was sort of wondering about how I was going to tackle language acquisition because it is a very large topic, and I was looking at the current issue of Language, which is the Journal of the Linguistic Society of America, and there is a review article by Holger Diesel about a Joan Bybee article called Language Usage and Cognition. And that's when routinization sort of came to my mind, because Joan Bybee wrote an earlier article in 2006 called From Usage to Grammar, the Mind's Response to Repetition. And one of the topics covered in this article is routinization. And I think it's very interesting to go over, and a very interesting way to segue into not only language acquisition, but language learning and language usage. Okay, so let me start there. So the basic question is this. How does one learn anything? So how does one learn, for example, to play the cello? If you consider any well-known cellist, perhaps Yo-Yo Ma, you know that if you watch them play cello, you really see quite a lot of things going on. You see very specific hand movements, very specific finger movements. I'm sure... I don't know specifically if this is true of Yo-Yo Ma, but I assume it is. He's probably very good at sight reading, so therefore his mind has been trained to look at a sequence of notes on a page, notes themselves being just symbols. If you remember back to the semiotics episode, symbols with just an arbitrary linking to some kind of meaning. Arbitrary association, that is. His mind can change those arbitrary symbols into what are essentially motor commands for his hands, ways in which he needs them to move, ways in which he needs his fingers to move, very specific ways, in fact, and the end result is playing a song on the cello, and playing it very well. The question is, how does this sort of thing happen? How do you learn to play the cello like that? Well, certainly, if you ask any layperson, they'd say, well, he's practiced. He's practiced a lot. Practice makes perfect, as the old adage says. And as it turns out, this is not far off from what needs to happen with any sort of cognitive task. We find that you can call a word that you can use to describe this sort of phenomena is routinization, sometimes called automaticization, sometimes called cognitive entrenchment, although that's a little bit more specialized. And what it means is that these motor movements for somebody like Yo-Yo Ma are essentially automatic. They're subconscious, if you will. He doesn't really have to think about them. He instead can put more brain power to working on reading the music. In other words, deciphering the symbols on the page. And you can put even more brain power to virtually anything, the better he gets at doing all these tasks. So the more automatic they become, the less conscious effort is required to do them. Now, if we think about speaking a language, this gives us an interesting sort of point to jump off here, because when we speak, we don't have to think about every little thing we're going to say. Okay, now let me give you another analogy for this. If you're going to build a building, okay, you're going to play architect for a little bit, chances are, if you've never done it before, it's going to be very difficult. And you're going to try and sort of build this building in a way that you think will cause it to stay standing, You're going to try and design it in such a way that it is stable, so on and so forth, right? And you're going to put a lot of conscious effort into doing these things. If you're going to build a sentence, well, then it's quite a different story, right? Because you can build a sentence without even thinking about it. Now, that sentence that I just said, you can build a sentence without even thinking about it. I didn't think about saying that before I just said it, right? I didn't have to sit here and design that sentence before it came out of my mouth. At least, I'm not conscious of that design, right? So, language is quite an automatic process. Okay, it's very much automatic. The question is, why is it automatic? Okay, so we know that making it automatic is important. Okay, the fact that there are routinized elements is important. Where the linguistic theory comes in is exactly what gets routinized or automatized or entrenched. That is the big question for language learning and for language acquisition. Now, Joan Bybee subscribes to something known as construction grammar, which I'll describe in a minute. But first I want to describe what this idea of routinization will entail in the sort of traditional Chomskyan view. Now, in the traditional Chomskyan view is the sort of building block view. So you have various linguistic elements, which are then put together by a set of rules to form, well, they can form anything. You can form words, you can form phrases, you can form entire discourse structures. And this is the sort of Chomskyan view is the building block view. I say that because you have a set of elements which are essentially building blocks that you put together, right? So you're going from the bottom up. So in this view, what would need to be routinized or automatized in order to, quote-unquote, learn a language? Well, certainly you need to know the associations with the sounds, right? So you have to have some kind of quick access to a lexicon of some sort. So if you're looking for the word chair, you don't want to have to sit there and think about that sound pattern being associated with that object. It should be automatic. So that when you look at a chair, it just comes right into your mind, chair. So if you want to talk about that chair, you can. If you want to tell somebody to sit in the chair, you can, so on and so forth. So that's perhaps the most obvious item that would need to be routinized in a Chomskyan view. What else? Well, the rules themselves, right? So there has to be some sort of subconscious set of rules that tells you how to put certain morphemes with other morphemes, certain words with other words, certain sequences with other sequences, certain phrases with other phrases, so on and so forth, and make more and more complex structures. And in various Chomskyan, various forms of Chomskyan theory, you'll find that this a lot of times entails a concept of transformation. So you need to have some sort of transformational rules which are automatized that you don't have to think about consciously, and yet still happen. So this transformational rules in Chomskyan theory are used to explain things like WH movement, raising and control phenomenon, things like this. Things that I don't think I've talked about before, but the basic idea is that elements will move from one position in a phrase to another position and leave what's called a trace. It's a way that the structure of phrases can still be described when elements don't show up in locations that they would be expected. This is called transformational grammar. So all those things would have to be entrenched or routinized or whatever word you want to call it. All these things would have to be automatic in order to say, yes, you know a language, right? You've learned a language. You can speak this language. You can understand this language. To achieve full fluency, that's what you're doing. You're automatizing these elements, right? Now that I brought up fluency, now let me go on to that. So clearly you can know these elements, but be slow at them. And what that means is that you get the basics, right? You understand the rules, but they're not completely automatic. So you have to put forth conscious effort in their processing, and therefore you're slower at it. You're not as fluent or fluid, if you want to call it that. So that gives you a nice way to explain the sort of stages of language learning in adults, right? So as you're learning a language, you start out very slow. You're very slow at making sentences, so on and so forth. That's because you have these rules that you're learning. You've picked up a sort of micro set of rules at the beginning, a micro lexicon, and still, because you have nothing automatized, routinized, you're very slow at producing the few utterances that you can. And you get quicker and quicker as time goes on. Why? Because as it becomes repeated, again, the Bybee article, the mind's response to repetition. It's all about repetition, right? So the more you repeat it, the more automatized it becomes, and therefore the quicker you get at it. And in some cases, the more accurate, because you resources, mental resources, cognitive resources that were tied up working on one thing are no longer tied up doing that, right? So there's a lot that's entailed by this. Or that this entails, I should say, concerning language processing and things like this. There's a lot that can be said when you start to think about language in these terms. Now, as I mentioned, Joan Bybee is not really a Chomskyan theorist. Instead, she subscribes to something called construction grammar, and I'm going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum now. I'm going to go even beyond what Bybee would suggest, and I'm going to suggest what would need to be automatized or routinized in a different construction grammar. This is the construction grammar of William Croft, and he has a book that he wrote called Radical Construction Grammar. Radical construction grammar. This radical meaning radical, out there, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but it is the truth. It's sort of the antithesis of the Chomskyan view. So first, let me give you a brief rundown about what radical construction grammar suggests. First and foremost, it suggests that there are no grammatical categories. So noun, verb, as universal categories, according to Croft, do not exist. Instead, what you have are constructions. Okay. Now, a construction can be probably described most clearly by looking at idioms. So idioms are things like break a leg, right? Where when you tell somebody to break a leg, you don't really mean that you want them to break their leg. It's a phrase which means good luck, right? Especially if somebody's going and acting in a play, I think is the sort of typical, stereotypical situation where that would be used. So you tell somebody, hey, break a leg, it means good luck, you want things to go well, so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting about that is break a leg, if you break it down into its parts, doesn't mean that, right? It means to break a leg, right? So the question is, how does one know that break a leg does not mean to break one's leg? How does one know that that in fact means good luck? Well, what Croft would suggest is that break a leg and other idioms are stored in the lexicon as full constructions. And break a leg would be described as a schematic construction. That is to say that it is a construction that still has pieces and parts which it can be broken into. However, it's still analyzed as a whole. Okay, so when you tell somebody break a leg, you never say break an arm, right? You always say break a leg. You don't change elements within the construction. However, you can do things like morphological change. So, you can say break a leg. You can change the tense. You still know how to change the grammatical agreement. So breaks a leg, right? This sort of thing. So that would be a schematic construction. Now, an atomic construction would be something in which the elements don't get reanalyzed as often. And the reason for atomic constructions is because construction grammar is a full spectrum theory. In other words, it covers things from simple words all the way up through full phrases. And all of these things are denoted as constructions, and all of them are stored in the lexicon and analyzed as entire units. Now, this is very interesting because the way that you get grammatical categories in radical construction grammar is by reanalyzing constructions. So you have some kind of common sentence Let's say something like, I'm going to the store. And the only way to know that store is a noun is by knowing the relation between store and the other elements of the construction. Right, so this would be another schematic construction that you can break down and analyze when you need to figure out what something is. In other words, how do I know if store is a noun? What environment does it show up in? In the constructions that I know, in the constructions in my lexicon. Now, this is actually very, very enticing to me and to many other linguists, because this actually allows you a lot of descriptive power, and it's quite a principled theory. And by that I mean it does explain quite a lot in a very descriptively adequate way, and it explains it in a way that's not circular. Right, so it fits all the data, and you don't have to redefine any of the data. One of the issues that I have with traditional Chomskyan theories, specifically here transformational grammar, is that if you're saying that an element moves such that there's a deep structure which has an element in one location and a surface structure which has an element in another location, and you're saying that there's some trace of that element that is retained in the original location, that trace element has no surface representation. There's no evidence for that element to be in that location. You're positing that the element is there because your theory says it should be there. Therefore, you're sort of applying a Band-Aid to your theory by expanding it you're adding complexity to it to fill in a gap introduced by it. Okay, it's a very circular sort of notion. Construction grammar doesn't really have that. From the get-go, it's been sort of designed to be descriptive, to describe the facts, and to describe it in a psychologically valid way, a cognitively valid way. And by this I mean routinization is the method by which construction grammar really makes a lot of sense, because after all, we don't hear words in isolation. We don't hear building blocks. We hear full constructions. We hear sentences. We get examples of sentences all the time, and it makes a lot of sense that we would sort of store them together, store them in units, such that if you hear I'm going to the store all the time, you remember it as I'm going to the store. You don't remember it as I am going to the store, and you certainly don't remember it as I be going to the store, right? So it's a very interesting theory, and it's one that I think really does hold a lot of water, although certainly it's not that widely accepted. But William Croft and Joan Bybee certainly are not unknown names in the linguistics community. Now, back to routinization. So what would you be routinizing if construction grammar was really the theory that best described what was actually going on in the brain? Well, first of all, you wouldn't necessarily be routinizing building block associations, right? So single words would not necessarily be automatized. You would not necessarily have every single word in your lexicon. You would certainly have some, right? Because as you sort of analyze constructions and you pull these single words out, then certainly, yeah, there's probably room for both a building block explanation and a construction explanation. However, in Chomskyan theory, we'd be saying that you routinize only building blocks. In construction theory, in construction grammar, we're saying that you routinize either whole phrases or smaller sort of mini phrases of just a few elements, or single elements. And we're saying that all of them would count as constructions, right? So the associations that you're routinizing are not just single words, but whole phrases. So a whole phrase and its meaning will be stored in the mental lexicon under this theory. And the beauty of that is that that's pretty much the whole story, right? Because if you're saying that you're automatizing just these constructions, and that you're pulling grammatical categories and grammatical rules from constructions that you hear, then that's it. You don't have to say anything more, right? Because it's a very elegant way to look at it, because you're saying that it just takes time to get enough exemplars and enough of these phrases into your lexicon to be able to do these sort of deep analyses, but that these analyses themselves are just sort of done mentally, right? So they don't have to be introduced to you as such. So that's routinization. Okay, that's what I wanted to talk about as an intro to language acquisition. Why? Because it starts to lay the groundwork for asking good questions about how language is learned, how language is taught, and in the case of children, how language is acquired. So this is going to sort of be my springboard. I'm going to sort of come back to this concept of routinization because I think it's incredibly useful in explaining these other topics. Okay? It also provides an interesting way to explain linguistic structures that are not necessarily what we would call optimal, right? So from a processing standpoint, and I may do an episode of the podcast on this as well. From a processing standpoint, there are certain patterns that are expected and are known to be sort of optimal. If we look cross-linguistically, we see the majority of languages falling into a certain set of patterns, a broad set of patterns, but a certain set nonetheless. There are languages, however, which break these patterns and break them very badly. And the question then becomes, why do such languages exist? And these aren't, I should mention, these aren't languages that most listeners would find obscure. These are languages like German. For example, German has a very interesting thing going on with its syntax, specifically the verb location, which is very odd cross-linguistically. And from a processing standpoint, if we look at the majority of the world's languages and we make assumptions on cognitive processing based upon those languages, those assumptions don't hold up when a language like German is thrown into the mix. And so the question is, how does that happen? How do you get these sort of non-optimal structures? How are those structures maintained if they're really non-optimal? And it turns out the construction grammar and routinization really gives you an interesting way to look at that. So that's actually something that I'm currently working on in my research. I think there's an interesting story to be told there, and one that would affect many facets of linguistics, not the least of which language learning, which I'll get more into the link with language learning on the next episode. All right. So with that, let me mention one more time the book that I mentioned earlier. It's called Radical Construction Grammar, Syntactic Theory in Typological Perspective by William Croft. It's a few years old. Let's see. It was published in 2001. So 10 years old, but still very interesting if you're interested in different theories other than a Chomskyan theory. Let's see. Joan Bybee, I mentioned. She has many articles, scholarly articles, peer-reviewed articles that are available. The current one that's being reviewed in language is called Language Usage and Cognition. And there is a review of that in the current issue of Language. If you have access to it through an academic institution, give it a read. And I think that's all I have for you guys today. So I want to thank everyone, as always, for your wonderful comments and suggestions. I hope this sort of mini-series on language acquisition will be sufficient. I'm going to try and get into as much detail as I think I can without sort of losing my audience. So